Hello, everyone, and welcome to Poetry, Policing, and Possibility. I am Henry Crawford, and before we begin, I'd like to observe a brief moment of silence in connection with the recent shootings in Texas and in Buffalo, New York. Okay, tonight we are going to join educator and author Anne Bracken and police officer and poet Ed Gillespie as they discuss their encounters with their fellow citizens enmeshed in serious societal trouble. Anne and Ed will share their poetry and offer fresh insights into the current legal and incarceration systems. We have handouts available on our Poetry, Policing, and Possibility website, so I'll just put a link into the chat where you can find those handouts, so feel free to take a look at them. Our journey tonight will start with Anne Bracken reading her poems. Then we'll go to Ed Gillespie, after which the poets will be joined in conversation. And if we have time, we'll take questions from people in the Zoom room. So let's get started. Anne Bracken has published 3 poetry collections: The Altar of Innocence, No Barking in the Hallways, Poems from the Classroom, as well as her collection, Once You're Inside, Poetry Exploring Incarceration. Her memoir, entitled Crash, a memoir of over-medication and recovery, will be published in late 2022. She is a contributing editor for the Little Patuxent Review and co-facilitates the Wild Readings Poetry Series in Columbia, Maryland, and also volunteers as a correspondent for the Justice Arts Coalition, exchanging letters with incarcerated people to foster their use of the arts. Her work has appeared in numerous anthologies and journals, including the Best American Poetry. Anne is a tireless advocate of using the arts to foster change in the areas of emotional wellness, education, and prison abolition. So with all that said, let's bring Anne Bracken up to the Poetry Policing Possibility Zoom stage. Anne?
Thank you, Henry. Thanks for
Have at it.
for the introduction. And it's so nice to see all of you here. There's one surprise guest. I'm going to call out Bill from Albuquerque, whom I haven't seen for probably at least 15 years. So and he was one of my first poetry friends. So it's really nice to have you here, Bill, and my daughter and Desiree. It's great to see everybody. So I'm going to be reading tonight from my book, Once You're Inside, Poems Exploring Incarceration. I based the poems on the experiences that I had working in 3 Maryland prisons between 2015 and 2018. So the first poem is called Lock Me Up. And when I talk about the hole, I mean solitary confinement, or as they euphemistically call it in prison, administrative segregation. Lock me up out here and elsewhere, and I won't ask you to remember how living 90 miles away from home burdens my family by design. Respect the rules, a mantra the guards repeat as I'm strip searched after each visit. Respect isn't a duality in my world, where a tossed dish lands me in the hole, a cauldron of despair. The fire of one more submission sears my heart with a fresh rage, yet I have no place to scream. I am slowly learning that no exposure of who I am or who I am becoming can erase the dark contours of my past. And the next poem is written in the voice of an incarcerated man. It's called What I Think About. My deepest fear is that no one waits for me. I sit in a barred cell, live next to a steel toilet, stained and reeking. You're nothing but an animal, the guards tell me, as they open my cage twice a day. Daily, I forgive myself, my younger self, so angry, so charged and reckless. My younger self, no tools, but swagger and steel stuffed under a mattress. I wish I could tell that boy how his grandma and baby sister loved him, But he pushed away all that kind of talk. I don't need y'all, he'd say. Don't need nothing from nobody. I hear those words bounce off the walls and fill my cell with their echoes. I weep for forgiveness. And I wrote that poem from all the shows that I've listened to and from all the people that I met that have been in solitary. And I wanted to tap into the emotion. So it's really not based on any one person, but it's, like a compilation of what somebody is probably feeling. This one is called Sandbags Against the Flood. When the writing teacher asks, "Where's Marco?" Daryl tells her he's in CLAP, Character Literacy Awareness Project, a class where the old guys teach the young ones what it means to be a man. When the writing teacher asks the men, "What do you need to prepare you for life outside, other than a GED?" The answers pour out like a Greek chorus. "It's overwhelming to leave here. I came in when I was just 16. How do I rent an apartment or get housing, a driver's license, a job? I don't know where to start." The men's needs stacking like sandbags against the flood. Daryl adds one more thought before he returns to the tears. We don't know how to be citizens. Now that poem comes from an actual conversation that I had with men during my writing group. You never knew what was going to come up in the writing group. So every plan was, temporary. A lot of people talk about how much it costs to put somebody in prison. And after volunteering there for 3 years in 3 different facilities, I just want to know where the money goes. Because this is a poem about the physical environment that I saw over the 3 years I was there. It's called Maintenance. In a place where water can be a curse, puddles in the corner reek of chemicals and etch the tiles brown with stains. Plastic buckets in the hallway brim with gray water. Bugs float atop rafts of sodden drywall. Trays rigged to the ceiling with steel straps catch the steady trickle of water. For over 2 months, a leaking pipe creates a lake in the hallway, and cotton mop heads contain the fetid water. When I point out the dangers of mold or slipping or bugs, one of the counselors tells me, those of us who work here have learned to walk around it. And I think there was a lot more than walking around the lake in the hallway, which she was telling me. This poem is a found poem, which for those of you who aren't writers means you pull a poem from a piece of prose that someone else has written. So one of my friends was reincarcerated and he was held at Baltimore Central Booking where people wait for a trial. And he wrote me a letter. And the letter was so filled with actual poetry that I asked him if I could make a poem out of it, and he gave me his permission. So this is called Letter from a Baltimore Jail. I face these 4 enemy walls, this cell robbing me of my desire to live. The courts have no care for my real story. To let them tell it, no Black man with a prior criminal history would drive away from gunfire. I've been writing a lot lately, the most important part of me, my true freedom within these pages. I've written to my girlfriend every day and 20 new poems. And I've started a new book called My Second Chance. I'm in the cell 23 hours a day since January 29th. Today is Valentine's, and I finally get a shower. I've maintained my hygiene with a bird bath at the sink. At first, I had no pen, no paper. There's no library here. I read the Bible every day and take beautiful lessons from it. There's so much writing on my case. I want to prove that men can change, or else others will fall victim to this wicked system. When I get more paper, I'll copy my poems for you. I'm down to 10 pages, using each one strategically. I send you all my love. And this next poem is about an encounter that one of the men told me about with a parole officer. It's called Privilege. Orient yourself to the scene. One man speaking to another, separated by a vacuum of power, a trespass of privilege. The imprisoned man places his documents on the table and harnesses his courage. Maybe this time he's got enough certificates: barber school, alternatives to violence, kitchen management. Fluent in the language of subservience, he answers the parole officer's questions. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Maybe this time, a respite for all of his accomplishments. Congratulations. You've done a lot since the last time I saw you. The parole officer thumbs through the file and then pushes it back across the table. Come back in 2 years. And I just heard a Chris Hedges podcast where he talks about almost the same thing happening. He was interviewing a group of formerly incarcerated men about their experiences. This is a poem about an event that I attended very early in the time I was working in the prison, the Literary Day of the Arts. The prison library hums and pulses with musicians practicing original tunes. The tattooed MC performs a final mic check. A few guards are scattered in the crowd, along with the Muslim chaplain and 2 social workers sitting in the audience. As I settle into my seat, I remember what one of the guards cautioned as I went through screening. We had a lockdown earlier, but things are okay now. He shrugged. I nodded. As I wait for the performance to begin, a chill of fear paralyzes my body. What am I doing in the basement of a men's prison? Images of hostage-taking men flash into my mind. But in another flash, I return to the library, where Anderson, the star of the writing group, steps up to the mic. Welcome, everyone, to our 2nd annual Literary Day of the Arts. One by one, he calls up his colleagues from the group, and I hear their words in a new way, accompanied by images on the screen, personal artwork, and music from their friends. A hush of respect falls over the room. At the end of the reading, someone lets me know that it's Anderson's birthday. In the back of the room, men line up for cartons of orange drink and single cookies wrapped in plastic, one for each person. I wish I could have brought you a cake, Anderson, but I wasn't allowed. He smiles at me and says, "That's okay, Miss B. This is as good as it gets for a birthday in the joint." How you're that cheerful, I'll never know. I spent a few sessions working in the women's prison. I actually worked in two different women's prisons, one a large one, one a very small subset of where the men are housed. This was in the larger women's prison. And I was really struck by this scene in the visiting room. It's called Visiting Room. Across from the visiting room, filled with comfortable chairs, a few sofas, and a table or two, visitors and imprisoned women gaze at a wordless warning across the hall. The corrections officer sits behind a glass wall and supervises the sign-in process. Behind her, a frame about 6 feet across and 5 feet high with 3 rows of handcuffs, carefully arranged by size. A number visible inside the cuffs. The first few cuffs, small enough for a young girl of 8 or 9, graduating to cuffs that could easily fit the wrists or ankles of a large woman. Beneath the cuffs are rows of chains. Any combination of cuffs and chains is possible, each chain longer, each link heavier and thicker. The cuffs and chains, cold, silent reminders, lining the shadow box across the hall. And that was quite a chilling sight, actually. And this last poem is the title poem. It's called Hope on Hold. Once you're inside, ignore the wreckage of time, the lined faces of men gray with age, the once cagey 16-year-old, the disorganized shuffle of papers and rules and feet, the torpor of boredom, thick as dreams of honey on toast. Once you're inside, every smile is suspect, every glance a risk. Even hope tucks into a corner when those doors groan closed. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne Bracken. Let's give her a good Zoom clap.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking us to a place poetry doesn't usually visit, and making an experience that is truly unique. So let's turn to our next poet tonight, Ed Gillespie. Ed is a 17-year veteran of the Baltimore City Police Department. His poetry books include On the Later Edition of Sancho Panza and Gentrifying the Plague House. He holds a BA in history from the George Washington University and an MLA from Johns Hopkins. So let's bring up Ed Gillespie to our Zoom stage. And Ed, can you unmute yourself? And
there we go. Greetings from PC. Hello. Got a greeting from my school in Philadelphia. Awesome. So hello, how are you? First of all, thank you, Anne. That was beautiful and very moving and evocative, and I can't wait to get into it with you. So I've got some pieces I want to read from my newest piece, Gentrifying the Plague House. These are poems I collected, various subjects at various times, but a good portion of what I did here is a chronicle of what I saw, what I've seen, what I've experienced as a police officer in Baltimore City. So a lot of what we do on patrol in policing is you get a call through the radio, you go to this place, and then a short story starts. You interact with someone, something happens, and you meet these characters. So this was my first call for what I found later we called a speedball, someone who had taken a speedball. So this is a drug-related call. So I'll first give you this, first of all, then I'll get into some details to what this means. Rapture of the Fishman. The Fishman kicked up his legs that morning. He slapped his hands on the concrete and he called out, chirping and gurgling with a voice like cracked glass and dry wooden splinters. The fishman tried to swim in midair that day, tried to swim on dry land, tried to swim through the congregation of jobless white t-shirts. He bashed his head down on the concrete of McMecken Street and let the red flowers spread across the sidewalk. The fishman danced as though he'd been hauled out of the sea and onto the deck of a schooner, christened the street with the foam and the spit that welled out of him after he jammed a speedball into the big vein of his right leg. He christened the street with his blood and his spit until a blonde medic, close to the end of her shift, came with naloxone to stick up his nose and wash him free of his Holy Ghost. So I came to understand, thank you. A speedball is when you have a very powerful stimulant and a very powerful depressant mixed. And so in many cases, you might have cocaine and heroin and put both of those into your system. And so moments like that are an invitation to, you can kind of look at this, do something procedural as a police officer, and then move on. I think some officers try to do that, not taking into account the trauma that they've seen and the trauma that they've taken with them, right? So seeing that for me, that was a first for me in my private school in Philadelphia, my suburban home. I did not see people doing things like this, and that was an invitation for me to see where I fit into all this. And I just detach myself, say that this is a dysfunctional person. Here's a process for you. Goodbye. Or ask, what would happen to make someone want to do this? Where is that? And so every time you see someone who's lived a dehumanized life and dehumanized moment, is a chance for you. It was a chance for me as an officer to try to figure out where I stand in terms of the humanity of the job that I do. This is a bit of magical realism from things I've seen in Baltimore. This is down from the center part of the city, down near police headquarters. I've got 2 poems from there, and I'll tell you about the geography of this. This is Lilith in transit. I saw one of Rossetti's stunners on the bus this morning. I'm pretty sure it was Lilith, but don't hold me to that. I mean, she had those cornforth lips, and she was brushing her hair, admiring her reflection in the mullion's fractured steel, but I could be wrong. I folded my paper, slumped in my seat, and watched my commuter Lilith preen her thick red curls as we shuddered past Holiday Street and the old boarded-up porno shop. Over her shoulder, I could see the place where Clara used to dance on her pole, and I swear the blind man on the corner of President and Baltimore, doomsday soothsayer with his all-seeing eye dog, hailed her as we passed. But my Lilith, incendiary in her affliction t-shirt, 2 rows up, only twisted her hair in those tortoise shell coils, pursed her lips, and waited for the next stop to arrive. Thank you. People seek magic wherever they are. They seek salvation. They seek faith. A drug counselor said to me once, part of the problem with humans and drug addiction is we're too adaptable. That we can be in horrible situations and say, okay, I can deal. And so we find our mythology and our personal religions and the beauty that keeps us going, even in the most destitute situations, the most spiritually bankrupt situations. And you can go down to the Block in Baltimore, and where I've seen a lot of when I've worked down there. If people don't know, the Block it's literally a block. It used to be, I think, 3 or 4, but it's now a block. It was the adult entertainment red light district for Baltimore. And in true Baltimore fashion, it's right next to police headquarters. And police headquarters in what was the Central District headquarters. So you have strippers and drug use and alcohol and debauchery, and a block over you have patrol cars lining the streets and detectives and officers walking in and out. And City Hall, right? City Hall is around the corner from there. And so you walk the streets. I've been in situations where I've walked down there and I've had the most fascinating conversations with people that are covered in needle tracks or are about to. I remember one woman saying, well, it was really fascinating. I really liked reading Moby Dick. It's so cool that you read that. And I'm going to go degrade myself now, and I'll talk to you later. And part of it was reaching out to me saying, I do feel degraded by this. So thank you. You helped me humanize myself for that moment. Let me just introduce you to a character here from that area. This is called Vixen in the Alley on New Year's Eve. To show me what she meant, what I must understand, she rises up on one foot, stretches one thigh open and away from its mate, stands ecce homo in platform heels. She tells me again that she has named herself Vixen and that she is the only white girl at the Diamond Club who has no Baltimore stigmata on the hollows of her arms, who does not have sleep shuddering the purple lids of her eyes. She is thick and she is healthy, she tells me again. She should be the one to dance for me, because tonight is the first night of the year, and she can tell that I have chosen the wrong words for far too many times. I have accepted far too much smoke, and that has only strangled me. I have left far too much shredded green glass in my wake. But none of this matters to Vixen in her platform shoes. She will forgive me my trespasses, she says, because this is the first of the year. The horseback cops are traversing in front of Eddie's like a fascist promenade, and she is the one meant to usher me inside. Thank you. I think something that occurs to me time and time again about policing, and I can only speak for policing in Baltimore, but you are often there to manage the amygdala, right? You are often there about the amygdala. It could be several amygdalas, it could be this one person, but a big part of it is what has an amygdala unfettered done to this person, done to this environment, and what does it do to you? So there's always the issue of atavism, of how far down will this person go. And I've had, like I said, the conversations I've had with women on the block when I'm working down there on a detail or whatever, about their experiences and the books they've read and the things they've done, and then they just very casually will lapse into a character, basically, that goes from their prefrontal cortex to their amygdala, and off they go into that world. And a police officer has to traverse that constantly, right? You have to, and a big challenge for police officers is clinging to that prefrontal cortex and not just being lost in the amygdala. Another one here. So you get to know the streets in Baltimore, and they have their own rhythm. And in many cases, people in a lot of our neighborhoods here, they don't leave very often where they live. They live in these very hermetically sealed villages. And those villages, they remember the things that have happened there time and time again. Time will pass, I tell her, and they will tear this house down. They will use guileless hammers and feral machines to smash its eyes and spill it brick by brick into the Gold Street alleyway. This is how they will find out that she wrote every night in a dollar store composition book, and that she tended to the shadow people with nubbin pencils and those precious gel pens that she hoards. I tell her to explain how sometimes shadow people pass through the living room walls, even on midsummer afternoons when we ate our dinners on trays watching Star Trek and turning out the Baltimore cacophony on our dead-end street. I hope she describes how they came up through the floor of the bathroom when her sister was preparing for her date, and that guy who wore a galaxy of gold across his fists. I watch her draw one, then two of them, in the rough edge smudged ways of sketch artist girls, and then seal her book in the upstairs crawl space. That is the part of the house that will cave in on itself when they knock the legs out from under this place and send the walls down to meet the earth. When you, oh, thank you. There's when you talk to people who live in places that you only visit, you go on your shift and you go there, you start to hear again their folklore, and you start to feel that, when people say, well, this house is haunted, well, the boy that was killed here a year ago, he still lives here. There's shadow people here. There are ghosts. Don't split the pole when you walk or it's bad luck. So again, every village that we build creates its own mythology, its own folklore, its own religion. And there's always a chronicler. One thing I found in Baltimore, someone is always chronicling things, even if it's just an oral history, the old lady who sits on the porch and watches. And I even had a recruit today say to me, I remember you. I was a kid when you worked in my neighborhood, and I remember you coming around. And they'll tell the stories of what the police did, tell the stories of the boy that lived in the neighborhood. And so these stories linger, they linger around, and they help to educate the next person that fills that space. It's funny, when a friend of mine read this poem at first, he said, well, I don't understand. Why would there be so much noise on a dead end street? He said, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, I said, well, if you live on a street in Baltimore, there's always someone out in the street, especially in the summer. And that dead end street becomes almost like a room, right? I'm sure I'm doing on time here, but let me give you one more. This is just a character, a person that I know from the neighborhood in Baltimore, who is she is a baton twirler, and she deals with fire. She is a fire eater. The Pele allowance. You had a lover who ate fire, who painted her face in oily black and red, and wore a second skin that made her look like a pyre of a rioter's rage each time she moved. She would go to the corner of this or that street when the midday men broke free, and she would twirl herself with her head canted back. She would catch glimpses and slices of the red brick canyon in her fractured vision, and the men would become statues for her. She would take torches into her mouth, and they would fall in love with her. She would spit her napalm over their heads, and they would follow the wake of her ashes, taking crisply folded bills from tailored pockets. Your lover would spin herself in a cloak of dreadlocks, fling fragments of fire into the air like a dervish majorette, and the men would search fruitlessly for the plastic bucket or the worn top hat in which to lay their tributes. Thank you. So there's always a running commentary. So I mean, and all of this has been a matter of me observing as I did my work as an officer and finding a way to find balance. I think how involved do you become? How do you shut off the humanity of the person that you see, and what's the damage that you take in? Or do you watch their damage? I mean, there's a whole swirling slew of questions that come around as you work this job in Baltimore City. But those pieces were particularly inspired by the work I've done here. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So Ed, thank you. That's Ed Gillespie. And what again, taking us to places that poetry, down avenues and streets that poetry doesn't usually visit. Thank you. Thank you so much. So at this point, I'm going to invite Ed and Ann to come together and have a discussion about their joint work and their projects and how they interact with each other's poetry. And so Ann, you want to kick that off? And you guys can, I'm going to let you go back and forth in a dynamic fashion there, and I'm going to stay out of your way and have at it.
All right. Thanks, Henry.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was struck by what you had to say about the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, because that's brain talk for intellect and emotion, like fight or
Right.
flight type of things. And, I'm the people that I encountered, I think they were victims of that kind of reaction when they were very young. So they went into prison, a lot of them when they were 15 or 16. And I met them when they were in their 30s. So they'd spent half their lives in prison. They'd taken classes in nonviolent communication or alternatives to violence. And uniformly, they said, we wish we'd had this much earlier. So, I taught in the schools for a long time, and I know most schools don't teach this. I'm wondering how you're handling it from the standpoint of training recruits, that awareness.
Mhm. So I find myself involved in that at a few different levels. One is I help mentor young men from some of the neighborhoods and at risk young people. And it's funny, we were doing a lot of martial arts with them. They would do their homework, we do martial arts, and then we're doing less of it. I talked to the fellow who runs the organization. He said, they need more time with stillness,
Mm-hmm.
and they need more role modeling of gentleness. And I realized that was really very true, because once again, you see that amygdala reaction from them very often. I mean, there's a young men who don't have the developed prefrontal cortex yet, and and then they're often in cultures that are telling them you must react in an extreme amygdala fashion, right? Extreme limbic system manner if someone challenges you, And so I work on that side of things with my recruits. For one thing, I try to, when you humanize the person with whom you're dealing, and I'm not saying you have to like what this person has done or the way that they live, but when you say, this is not an archetype of evil or an animal, this is a human being, and this is these are what ACEs are, these, these adverse childhood experiences. And this is what it literally does to the human nervous system. So when you're dealing with someone, and this is a difficult thing, that in many cases, not always, but in many cases, if the officer can become somewhat yin while a person is erupting, right? Because I told them, sometimes you're the prefrontal cortex for a whole community. Right? In many cases, people will come to you to be that prefrontal cortex. Something has gone haywire. And this is why it's easy I had a big conversation with my recruits today about this. It's easy to dehumanize when you see behavior that seems inhuman to you. That seems like, I'm not used to a whole group of people fighting in the street. I mean, I was thinking about things I've seen, like 2 families have come out from their homes on either side, and there's literally 100 people in the street fighting. So it's easy to you can either say, all right, what would cause humans to behave this way? Look, I will continue to radically humanize you, no matter how difficult you make it, because I must understand how this is part of the human condition. Or I can say, this is a bunch of animals and I'm going to treat them like that. And it's easy to slip into that. Your brain likes to take shortcuts, right? Your brain likes to what's called to dementalize. Dementalizing meaning I'm not going to attribute any rational thought to anything that you do. There's no thinking went into this. You just behave out of impulses. If I can sway myself away from that, and this is hard, and this is what I mean, because officers are traumatized over and over again, and their amygdalas are triggered over and over again, right? And if you're able to say, okay, this is a really bad situation. How can I get people into their upstairs brain, into their prefrontal cortex, and start to see, because these are probably a whole slew of traumatized people. But all of that has to start with humanization. I thought it was interesting and locked me up when I looked at your enjambment. The way you did burdens my family by design, where a tossed dish lands me in the hole, yet I have no place to scream. I feel like it was literally the way the enjambment is done, where it's kind of pulling itself. It's literally physically seems to be pulling itself from the stream of the rest of the poem. Almost is like, this is a piece of me that's it's so painful. Like, burdens my family by design. Like, you're not just saying I must be punished for a thing that I did. It's like, you know what? You're being punished, and almost like let your line be cursed type thing, like, so the enjambment there stuck out to me because those, I think, were very amygdala lines, very limbic system. The pain in those lines were just particularly visceral. And for me to remember that some people live in that space constantly, live in that space of my family is burdened by design. I have no place to scream.
Right. I mean, the people in prison know that they have to be obedient, they have to be subservient, they have to look tough, or else they'll get creamed from one side or the other. And their families are burdened because now private companies are coming into prisons. They're charging exorbitant rates for phone calls. They're running the commissaries and charging a whole lot of money. During the pandemic, they were trying to switch everything to only video visits at a great cost to the families. And, Maryland isn't a very big state, but if you're from Baltimore and you're imprisoned in Hagerstown, that's a burden for the family to get there, to go and visit you. And then, even when I worked in the prison and they knew when we were coming, some days we would show up and they would say, nope, you can't come in today. And that I had families tell me that happened to them too. They would drive all the way to a prison and they'd be told that they couldn't visit and they'd have to come back in a week. So, it's a system that's, in my mind, cruel and excessively punitive. And I think America, in large part, I guess because of our Puritan beginnings, is very much about good and evil, good and evil, and punish or reward. And I don't think we have a sense of, what happened to you. Like, even as a teacher, there were people that I worked with that would talk about bad kids. Mm-hmm. And I really don't think that there are bad kids. I think that there are kids that bad things have happened to, and then they have, crappy behavior. But it's your job as the adult in the room with the prefrontal cortex to kind of work with them and show them that you can see a different side of them and maybe even bring that out. But the mindset, even in the schools where I worked, they had 3 or 4 steps that you went through and then you got suspended. So it was punishment oriented. It wasn't, as they say now, restorative justice, where you have an awareness of what you did wrong and how it impacts the community, and then what you might do to remediate things.
Right. And it's interesting though, because a lot of the philosophers that guided the founding fathers and that guide a lot of the basis of our Western society, or supposed to be humanist society from the Enlightenment. Cesar Beccaria was one of my favorite philosophers, and John Locke both talked about how it really does not do anything salubrious for the society to just be gratuitously punitive,
right,
towards people. And we even enshrine that in the Eighth Amendment. Yeah, it's not uncommon though, because we drop down, like, I'm just so mad at that person for what they did. And you know what? I've seen people do horrible things to other human beings. But then I have to detach myself and say, even if I personally could torture this person, we have to give ourselves over to a system that has to be balanced for all of us. I mean, it has to be, you have to ask, going to Kant's ideas about universality, all right, where he says, this thing that you think is right, you'd want this done to everyone all the time, right? Do you want to live in that society? Mm-hmm. And this is something that police officers have to be very wary. I just read a book on fascism and how police officers are often, fascism is often built on the backs of the average police officer.
Mhm.
And we were working a marathon one day, and this guy said, look, I have to get across the street. And I said, well, I can't stop these people right now. And he goes, you can do whatever you want. He says, you can stop them. I said, well, I can't. They're moving through. I gotta wait for a gap. And he said, no, you can do it. That's what that thing on your hip is for.
Mm. Mm.
And I said, do you want to live in that country? I said, do you want to live in a country where a police officer would arbitrarily do that? Because remember, that means I could do it to you too, and to your kids, right? And that you have no say in what government does to you. He goes, hey man, I didn't want to get into it with you. I just was saying, but it's very serious.
Right.
And we have to maintain, this is, you kind of take these concentric circles of who am I in terms of the social contract, who am I in terms of my professionalism, and then who am I as an individual sentient being. If I lose my humanity, and if I start using my power as a weapon, right? If I dehumanize him and I dehumanize myself, we've lost everything, not just my position, but this is where totalitarianism begins, right? And to be able to look at literature, like when I have my recruits read an excerpt of Steinbeck, of Tom Joad talking about police officers' cruelty towards them. And I have James Baldwin talking about police officers' cruelty and saying, you know what, this is what happens to the human when the police officer goes off, as we say, off the rails or off the hook, when authority becomes the main thing, when punitive authority becomes the point, as opposed to, and I'm realizing this is the thing I want to emphasize more and more with my recruits, you need to be a proactive, radical advocate for constitutionalism and humanism and Western democracy and all of those underlying things that are supposedly make up what we do, right? Versus being a proactive advocate for getting them.
Yeah.
Crime fighting will come. You're a cop in Baltimore. You'll have more, you're good to go, right? But I need to see you become an advocate for humanism, because that's the part that needs emphasis.
Wow, what an extraordinary consciousness raising discussion. I'm flabbergasted. Absolutely extraordinary. Now, Bill Nevins had a very fascinating question that he put into the chat, which I think I can go to both of you guys, okay? But it was originally delivered to Ed, and he said, Edward, do you have an opinion about The Wire or the more recent We Own the City series on HBO? And I would put it to Anne more like, what do you think of like Orange is the New Black? And with the idea of we see these things, most Americans, through the lens of television. What are we missing? What are we getting? And I would put that to the two of yous. Anne, you want to start, or who wants to grab it?
I would happy to. I've watched some of We Own the City, and it's funny, I was sitting there with my wife watching it, and she said, you keep groaning. And it's really very chilling. It's really very chilling, because when you see people that you know, people with whom you've worked, people that were supervisors and co-workers portrayed by actors, and you watch things unfold, and you can say, I was working at this time. I was literally in the building when that was said, and some of the things definitely they're fictionalized. They're like representative, but what do I think of them? I think I work with a lot of phenomenal people that do a tremendous job, and that we have a tremendous amount of damage that's been done to what is at its root a very noble cause and a very noble institution, and that we have a tremendous amount of we bear the onus for a tremendous amount, and we have a lot of work to do. And I'm glad that I was happy to see it out there. I know there's much debate going on. Officers get into arguments over it, and actually not big loud ones. I'm hearing more pocket conversations. I think it illustrates that we are really we're going through a tough adolescence in law enforcement, and we are reestablishing ourselves. I told my recruits, a lot of this is going to come down to you. You're going to have to learn to become pilots, build a plane, and fly it at the same time.
Wow. Okay, Anne, how do you know, prison is the prison experience is the topic of many, many films and television. What is your take on how they're portrayed to us? Do we see, are they missing? Are we getting shortchanged or what?
I think most of the impression that I've gotten, at least from the male characters, is that they're pretty, you know, some of them are portrayed as people who've been done wrong. Some of them are portrayed as just mean hard asses, as you know, who just don't care about anything. And I think that was my biggest takeaway from being in the prison. You know, these men, from the very first moment I met them, they were kind, they were extremely polite, they were welcoming. And I think the most amazing thing was that they trusted me. I mean, I guess because I was willing to come in there and sit in a room and listen to what they had to say, and ask them what they wanted to learn. So I keep saying to people, you know, one of the reasons I wrote the book is that people in prison are not who you think they are. Mm-hmm. They're not all really bad, awful people. In fact, watching We Own This City, I thought some of the police were a lot worse than some of the people I met in prison, which is really chilling as a lifelong Baltimore resident and somebody who grew up trusting the police and everything, and to see the lawlessness of a group of police, certainly not the whole department, but a large enough group, was really disturbing. And you know, to see the dynamic of the people in the city getting called to go on a jury and saying, I can't serve on a jury. I had cops beat up my brother. I had cops beat me up. You know, that kind of thing was like, yeah, we have a lot of work to do. But I'm glad it's out there, because you can't address a problem until you know about it and you're willing to face it.
Okay, now we can take, at least we got time, I think, for one question from somebody who I can unmute. Does anybody have a question, or have we covered enough ground tonight? What do you think? And the poets have worked very hard, so maybe maybe we'll give them a little rest, and let's give them a big Zoom clap here for just an excellent poetry reading. Just an excellent poetry.
You. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And right, so as we prepare to close down this Zoom session, I hope you have all enjoyed tonight's presentation. Please download the handouts from the website. Thank you all for coming, and I wish you all the best in all of your endeavors this year. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Ed. Thanks, everybody, for coming in.
Thank you.
So long on behalf of poetry, policing, and possibility.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody, for coming. It was great to have you here.
Thank you very much for coming.